woman sits across from her therapist and says, "I don't know which of my opinions are actually mine." The therapist waits. Like, I believe what I believe. I know what I value, but when I trace it back, where did this come from? I realize I can't remember choosing any of it. It was just already there. My parents' voice, my teacher's warnings, things I absorbed before I knew I was absorbing them. She looks down at her hands. If I remove everything I was given, what's left? This is not a crisis of confidence, not a crisis of origin. The moment when you realize that the personality you thought was yours, the values you defend, the fears that drive you, the roles you perform, might be a collage of borrowed fragments, pieces of people assembled into something that looks like a self. And the question that follows is not comfortable. If your personality was inherited, what part of you is actually alive? Today, we examine the architecture of the self you never chose, the process psychologists call introjection, the unconscious absorption of others' values, fears, and identities before you had the capacity to consent. We explore why this mechanism remains hidden, why questioning it stabilizes everything you use to orient yourself in the world, and what it means to attempt the terrifying work of separating what was given from what is genuinely yours. As you listen, notice something. When you think about your core beliefs, about right and wrong, about what matters, about who you should be, do they feel chosen, or do they feel like gravity, like something that was always there, unquestionable, woven into the fabric of reality itself? Notice if your throat tightens when I ask this. Because the borrowed self is not just a philosophical problem, it is a lived imprisonment, and most people never realize they are carrying someone else's architecture inside them, executing programs they did not write, living according to blueprints they never saw. The psychoanalyst Melanie Klein discovered something that changed how we understand the formation of identity. She found that from the first moment of life, the infant is engaged in a psychological process that shapes everything that follows. She called it introjection, the taking in of external objects, primarily the mother, and incorporating them as part of the internal world. Klein described how the infant experiences the mother's breasts as the first object. When the breast is present, nourishing, satisfying, it is experienced as good. When it's absent, withholding, frustrating, it is experienced as bad, and the infant, unable to tolerate the complexity of a mother who is both, splits these experiences into two separate objects, the good breast and the bad breast. The good breast is introjected, taken inside, incorporated as part of the self. The bad breath is projected outward, expelled, made external. This is not a conscious process. This is the foundation of ego development. The self is built from what you swallow, from what you internalize, from the objects, primarily the mother, but later the father, siblings, teachers, culture, that you incorporate into your internal world. And here is the crucial point. The introjected object is not the actual person. It is a distorted version, shaped by your needs, your fears, your primitive impulses. Klein found that the introjected mother is colored by the infant's own sadistic fantasies, by the aggression and anxiety that the infant projects onto her. What you internalize is not reality. It is your experience of reality, filtered through your earliest attempts to survive psychologically. The ego, in Klein's model, is a collage, a composite of introjected objects, held together by the desperate need to preserve the good and expel the bad. And this process continues throughout childhood. You internalize your parents' values, their fears, their unspoken rules about what is acceptable and what must be hidden. You absorb their disappointment, their approval, their silences, their rage. You organize yourself around these internal objects, building a personality that can navigate the world they created. But you do not remember doing this. You do not recall the moment you decided to value what they valued, to fear what they feared, to become what they needed you to become. It simply happened, before language, before choice, before you had any concept of self to protect. The self is built from what you swallow, and what you swallow becomes you, becomes the voice in your head that tells you what is right, what is shameful, what is possible, what is forbidden. Notice what your body does when you hear that. If this feels abstract, stay with it. It becomes personal soon. Donald Winnicott, another British psychoanalyst, extended this understanding with a concept that cuts even deeper. He described two aspects of the self, the true self and the false self. The true self, in Winnicott's formulation, is based on spontaneous, authentic experience. It is the part of you that feels alive, that has genuine needs and desires, that exists before socialization. It is the infant who cries when hungry, who demands attention without guilt, who simply is. But this true self requires something specific to survive. It requires what Winnicott called the good enough mother, a caregiver who is attuned enough to respond to the infant's spontaneous gestures, who mirrors back the child's aliveness, who adapts to the child's needs rather than demanding the child adapt to hers. When this attunement fails, and Winnicott was clear that it fails regularly to varying degrees, something else develops, the false self, a defensive facade that the child constructs to cope with a world that does not respond to their authentic needs. This child learns compliance, learns to show only what the caregiver wants to see, learns to suppress spontaneous gestures that were met with disapproval or absence, and in doing so, the child creates a version of themselves that can survive in that specific environment. The false self is not malicious, it is protective. It is the child's attempt to preserve the true self by hiding it, by creating a surface that can interact with the world without risking the annihilation experience of having the true self rejected, ignored, or exploited. But here is the tragedy. Over time, the false self becomes dominant. The performance becomes the person. The mask becomes mistaken for the face. This is why being yourself feels dangerous. Because the self you present to the world was constructed as a defense. The one that knows how to be polite, how to be productive, how to be acceptable. And beneath it is a true self that you barely remember. A self that was hidden so long ago that you are no longer sure it exists. Winnicott found that adults with dominant false selves often feel empty, dead. They function well, they succeed externally, but internally there is a hollowness, a sense that they are performing rather than living, that they are watching themselves from the outside rather than experiencing themselves from within. The false self can navigate the world, but it cannot feel alive, because feeling alive requires access to spontaneity, the authentic desire, to the true self that was hidden away decades ago for its own protection. And when people begin therapy, when they start to question why they feel so disconnected despite appearing so functional, they encounter this split. They realize that the person they show to the world is not the person they are, or worse, they realize they have forgotten who they actually are beneath the persona they constructed. The danger isn't the mask, it's that the mask became your face, and now you cannot take it off without feeling like you are disappearing. Consider what you believe about success, about relationships, about what makes a life meaningful. Where did these beliefs originate? Most people, when pressed, trace them back to family, to the spoken and unspoken rules of the household they grew up in, to the values their parents demonstrated through their choices, their praise, their disappointment, to the culture they were immersed in, its assumptions about gender, about class, about what is honorable and what is shameful. You absorbed these messages before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate them, before you could ask, do I agree with this? Does this reflect my experience? Is this true, or is this just what I was told? Psychologists call this social conditioning, but it goes deeper than that. It is not just that you learned rules, it is that you internalized an entire identity, a sense of who you should be, what you should want, how you should measure your worth. And this internalization is not neutral. It comes with emotional weight, with loyalty, with the sense that to question these inherited values is to betray the people who gave them to you, to betray your family, your community, the dead who came before you and passed this down. If this makes you uncomfortable, notice why. Because questioning the origin of your identity is not just intellectually destabilizing, it is emotionally destabilizing. It threatens the attachments that have organized your life, the people you love, the belonging you depend on, the version of you that they recognize and approve of. When you begin to ask which of my beliefs are actually mine, you risk discovering that most of them are not, that you have been living according to a script handed to you, that your personality is a performance of inherited roles. And this realization does not feel like freedom, it feels like disintegration. You are living someone else's answer to a question you never asked. And the moment you see this, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how much of your life is organized around avoiding the disapproval of internalized figures. Your father's voice in your head telling you what a responsible person does. Your mother's anxiety, which became your anxiety, which you now mistake for your own discernment. You notice that when you make decisions, you are often not asking, what do I want? You are asking, what would they approve of? And they are not even present. They are ghosts, introjected objects, psychological structures you carry inside you that you mistake for yourself. What happens next is where it gets worse. Because once you realize your identity is largely borrowed, the natural response is to try to be authentic, to strip away the false self, to find the true self underneath, to finally, after years of performing, just be yourself. But research reveals a disturbing paradox. Studies show that people report feeling most authentic not when they express their unique qualities, but when they conform to specific socially approved traits: extroverted, emotionally stable, conscientious, intellectual, agreeable. In other words, we feel authentic when we act like the ideal party guest or the perfect employee, when we perform a very specific version of acceptability. This is the authenticity paradox. The attempt to be genuine often becomes another performance, another way of constructing a false self, but this time under the banner of authenticity. You see this everywhere now. People curating their authentic online presence, leaders performing vulnerability as a leadership strategy, the exhausting labor of appearing real. And beneath all of it is the same mechanism. You are still trying to be what you think you should be, still organized around external approval, still performing, but now the performance is meta. You are performing authenticity itself. This leads to what researchers call authenticity fatigue, the deep exhaustion of trying to be yourself when you are not sure what that means, when every attempt to access the true self feels like another construction, when you cannot tell the difference anymore between a spontaneous expression and a strategic presentation. People report feeling like different people in different contexts, online versus offline, at work versus at home, and neither version feeling fully real. The fragmentation is not because you are being fake. It is because the self you are trying to access was never unified to begin with. It was always a collage, always borrowed, always assembled from pieces of other people's expectations and your own desperate attempts to survive them. And the harder you try to find your authentic self, the more you reinforce the very mechanism you are trying to escape. You create a new false self, one that looks like authenticity but is still organized around compliance, still trying to be the person you think you should be. But now that person is someone who is authentic, which is just another role to perform. If you feel the urge to pull away right now, that urge is part of the pattern. Carl Jung identified another dimension of this problem. He called it the shadow, the parts of yourself that you rejected and repressed because they were incompatible with your conscious self-image. Everything you perceived as inferior, evil, or unacceptable becomes part of the shadow. The anger you were taught to suppress, the ambition you were told was selfish, the vulnerability you learned to hide, the desire you were made to feel ashamed of. And here's what makes this particularly relevant. The shadow is often composed of qualities that were rejected not because they were genuinely destructive, but because they did not fit the identity you were given, the persona your family needed you to maintain, the role your culture assigned you. Jung found that the shadow is encountered almost always through projection. You see in others what you cannot see in yourself. The person who irritates you with their arrogance. That may be the assertiveness you disowned. The person whose neediness repulses you. That might be the vulnerability you were punished for showing. You are fighting yourself in other people's faces. Because the introjected values that organized your personality required you to split off parts of yourself that threatened those values. And those parts do not disappear. They remain active in the unconscious, projecting themselves onto the external world, creating conflicts that feel like they are about other people but are actually internal battles externalized. Jung wrote, "If you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a man has become a serious problem to himself, and he is now unable to say that they are wrong, and they must be fought against. Such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. Let your shoulders drop if they can. This is the burden of recognizing the borrowed self. You can no longer blame others for embodying what you have disowned. You must confront the fact that your personality was built by rejecting aspects of yourself that did not fit the inheritance you received. And those rejected aspects have been running your life from the shadows, determining who you are attracted to, who you despise, what you avoid, what you compulsively pursue. Notice what your body is doing right now, because if this is landing, if you are recognizing the pattern, your nervous system is responding. The tightness in your chest, the urge to dismiss this as abstract theory, the impulse to stop listening, these are defenses, the false self protecting itself, the introjected objects resisting examination. This is the part no one tells you. The work of distinguishing the borrowed self from the authentic self is not liberating at first, it is terrifying, because your self of identity, your morality, your relationships, everything you use to orient yourself in the world, is built on the foundation of what you introjected. To question that foundation is to risk collapse, to risk discovering that there is no solid ground beneath you, that the person you thought you were is a construction, that your values are not yours, that your personality is a defensive structure rather than an expression of something essential. And worse, the people who love you may only love the borrowed self, the version of you that fits their expectations, the role you agreed to play. If you begin to shed that, to access something more genuine underneath, you risk losing them, losing their recognition, losing approval, the belonging that has sustained you. This is why being yourself is not just difficult, it is existentially threatening, because the self you might discover, if there is one at all, will not be recognizable to the people who have known you all your life. It would not fit the family narrative. It will disrupt the roles that have organized your relationships. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who you were conditioned to be. But he was clear about the cost. Individuation requires isolation, requires a period of withdrawal from the collective, from the inherited identity, from the introjected values. And during that withdrawal, you are alone in a way that most people cannot tolerate. This is why most people stop here, alone with the question, if I remove everything I was given, what remains? You are not late, you are not broken, you adapted. Some people discover that what remains is very small, a few genuine preferences, a handful of authentic desires, a faint sense of aliveness that was buried beneath decades of compliance, and they must build from there, slowly, without the scaffolding of borrowed identity to support them. Others discover that almost nothing remains, that the true self was hidden so early, protected so thoroughly by the false self, that it is no longer accessible, and they must grieve. Grieve the self they never got to become, the life they never got to live, the spontaneity that was sacrificed for survival. This is not a process you undertake lightly. This is not self-help. This is a dismantling of the psychological structure that has kept you functional. And there is no guarantee that what emerges on the other side will be better, only that it will be more yours. So how do you do this work? How do you distinguish what was given from what is genuinely yours? You start by tracing. When you encounter a belief about what you should do, about what is right, about what you should be, you pause and you ask, where did this come from? Whose voice is this? Can I remember choosing this, or was it already there? Most of the time, you will find that it was already there, internalized from family, culture, early experiences. And that does not mean it's wrong. It means it is inherited. And the question becomes, do I still agree with this? Does this serve me now? Or am I carrying it out of loyalty to the people who gave it to me? This practice is not comfortable. You will discover that many of your values are not yours. Many of your fears are not yours. Many of your sense of what is non-negotiable is not yours. They are echoes, fragments of other people's lives inserted into yours before you could consent. And when you see it, you face a choice. You can recommit to those values consciously, making them yours through deliberate choice, or you can release them, and that release feels like betrayal, like abandoning the people who shaped you, like rejecting the inheritance. But it is neither. It is differentiation, the slow, painful work of separating your identity from the identities that were projected onto you, of distinguishing between what you absorb and what you actually are. The woman who sat across from her therapist, who said she did not know which opinions were her, began this work. She started noticing. When she felt strongly about something, she would pause. She would ask, is this me or is this my mother? Is this my conviction or is this the script I was handed? And most of the time she found it was the script. The voice in her head was her father's disapproval. The anxiety she felt was her mother's fear of judgment. The relentless productivity was the family's unspoken rule that worth must be earned through achievement. She grieved the realization that so much of her life had been organized around introjected values, grieved the years spent performing a version of herself that was never actually her. But slowly, in the space created by that grief, something else began to emerge. Small preferences, quiet desires, a faint sense of what she actually wanted, separate from what she thought she should want. It was not dramatic. It was not a revelation of a hidden true self waiting to burst forth. It was tentative, uncertain, fragile. And that is the truth of this work. You will not find a solid self underneath. You will not discover some essential core that was always there waiting to be uncovered. You will find a process, a capacity for choice, an ability to notice when you are executing inherited programming and to choose in that moment whether to continue or to deviate. You will find that authenticity is not a state, it is a practice, the ongoing work of distinguishing between reaction and response, between automatic compliance and conscious choice, between the borrowed self and whatever you are becoming. You are here because you recognize something, some part of you suspects that the person you present to the world, maybe even the person you think you are, is not entirely yours, that you have been carrying inherited fragments, performing roles, executing code you did not write. And you are right to suspect this, because the self is not given, it is not discovered, it is constructed. And most of that construction happened without your conscious participation, before you could choose, before you could consent. The work is not to find your true self. The work is to notice the borrowed self, to see it clearly, to trace its origins, to distinguish within what you internalized and what you might actually believe if you were free to choose. This does not lead to certainty. it leads to a different relationship with uncertainty, to the recognition that you are not a fixed thing. You are a process, a set of possibilities that were constrained by the identity you were given and the roles you agreed to play. And in seeing that, you create a space to choose differently, to experiment, to deviate from the script, to discover slowly what remains when you stop performing inherited identity. The borrowed self will resist this. The introjected objects will tell you that questioning them is dangerous, disloyal, that you are losing yourself. But you are not losing yourself. You never had yourself to lose. You had a collage, a collection of borrowed fragments, and now you can begin to build something else. Not from nothing, from the materials you have, but consciously, deliberately, with awareness of what is inherited and what is chosen. This is individuation, not the discovery of who you are, but the creation of who you might become, the slow differentiation of your identity from the identities that shaped you, the patient work of living as yourself, even when you are not sure what that means. Take a breath before the next thing you do. If you are here, you are already questioning, and subscribing can simply be a signal to yourself that you are willing to continue. If this resonated, if you recognize yourself in the woman who could not identify her own opinions, if you felt the weight of inherited values, if you noticed the terror beneath the question, who am I without them? Take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more investigations into the hidden architecture of identity. And know this, you are not broken for carrying borrowed fragments. Everyone does. The only difference is that you are beginning to see them, and seeing them is how you begin to choose differently. The borrowed self is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And the work of separating what was given from what is yours is the work of becoming real, not perfect, not certain, but real.